Dutch Republic, the Baroque period. During this time, the Dutch Republic was the Protestant portion of the Netherlands. Patrons of the arts were really not the church, but actually most of the prosperous middle class. They wanted stuff like portraiture, landscapes, cities and domestic lives of their country, still lifes of interior scenes, and exotic objects. They were interested in subjects of history, mythology, scientific discoveries, and colonial exploration. Art was found in many homes in the Dutch Republic, even in shops and homes of bakers, butchers, shoemakers, and blacksmiths. So as I mentioned, portraiture was very popular. Dutch Baroque portraiture varied from single portraits in simple settings to allegorical depictions of people in elaborate costumes surrounded by symbols. They were accurate depictions of facial features and costumes. These were the most important. And then second was setting the mood or emotion of the sitter, that the artist could convey the mood or emotion. Group portraiture served to document membership of an organization. This was very popular in the Dutch region. So basically they would make large canvases filled with many people who would share the cost of the commission, and they would have their portraits done together to depict like a club or something like that. One of the artists of this period was Frans Hals, and he was alive from about 1581 to 85 to 1666. And he was really the leading portraitist in Haarlem. He developed a style grounded in the Netherlandish love for naturalism and inspired by Caravaggio's style. Like Velázquez, he was interested in optical effects of light on shapes and textures. His style was bold, with slashing strokes and angular patches of paint. From a distance, his work shows all colors merging into solid forms over which light seems to flicker. So kind of like the Las Meninas by Velázquez. This is his Officers of the Haarlem Militia, the Company of St. Adrian, from about 1627. Here we can see that example of the group portraiture that I was talking about earlier. Usually artists arrange group portraits in neat lines and rows, so it's kind of like your old elementary school photographs, to depict everyone's face clearly and equally. But here, Hall's composition depicts not just a group of people sitting for a portrait, but an interaction, a social event. So he makes the image dynamic. He uses strong diagonals. We can definitely see that through here, pulling us in, and even right here as well. So he's pulling us in with the strong diagonals, which is so iconic of the Baroque style. Through gestures as well as the sashes and the flags or banners. Contrasting with the regularity of the table, we have the window and banner in the corner. He does a great job showing us what contemporary costume would look like, showing status of the group, and really giving art historians a lot of great things to study. The portrait is of a company in charge of the military protection of the city. The company was made out of several units. The officers came from the upper middle class, of course, and they held their commissions for 3 years. Each company was organized like a guild, so we've seen guilds before and we kind of understand what that means, under the patronage of a saint. When the men were not at war, they're not alert, ready for war, the company functioned really as a fraternal order, more like a club. So they would hold stuff like archery competitions, they would take part in processions of the city, and they would maintain an altar in a local church. So just like the same things that a guild would take over, really, except for they didn't regulate professions. You can see that he does use a touch of idealism, but we do get a great sense of individuality in each man's image. Here's another example of a female artist involved in the Dutch Republic. This is Judith Leister. She was alive from about 1609 to 1660. Many people think that she is one of Hall's students, the guy we just looked at. She entered the Harlem Guild of St. Luke in 1633, and she actually took on pupils of her own. She had her own studio, and she became a competitor of Hall's. This painting, which is now called Self-Portrait from 1635, is in the National Gallery in D.C., so if you get a chance to go up to the National Gallery, go and check this out. For a long time, art historians thought that this was painted by Hall's, and it was considered one of his finest works. But recently, it was discovered that it's actually been painted by Judith. They cleaned it and uncovered her distinctive signature with the monogram JL and a star. So that's how they know that it actually was by her. It refers to her surname, which means pole star. Her work shows the influence of Caravaggio's naturalism, a little bit of the Tenebrism effects. She has very large figures in a foreground, and she usually uses kind of theatrical themes. She's primarily known for her informal scenes of daily life, which have moralistic undertones. In her self-portrait, we see that she is pausing from her work to look at the painting's viewer. She is dressed very elegantly. She's sitting in a very fine chair. These are symbols of her status and her success. She uses fine brushwork in her skin and in the rough, but then she uses broad strokes of thick paint in her clothing. This contrasts to the soft loose brushwork of the painting on her easel. There's lots of things to think about in this image. Here she is painting a self-portrait, but she's showing herself as painting a man. Is this a statement? Is this kind of the purpose of this image? It's kind of something to think about. Here's a couple more examples of her work. You can see kind of the influence in the subject matter of Caravaggio here, when he also did a lot of musicians. Probably the best known painter of the Dutch Baroque style is Rembrandt, who was alive from 1606 to 1669. Now, mostly, the reason he's the most famous is because many of his paintings have survived, and he made a lot of paintings. He was working in Amsterdam in the 17th century. He was one of 9 children born to a miller and his wife. He studied painting with the local artists in Leiden. Later, he studied briefly with Pieter Lastman, who was a principal painter in Amsterdam at the time. If you go to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts or the National Gallery, I think you'll find some images by Lastman. Lastman worked in Rome, and he learned the styles of the Carracci and Caravaggio, and he's actually the one that shared these styles with Rembrandt. So Rembrandt returned to Leiden in 1626, and there he painted religious and historical scenes. In 1631, he was back in Amsterdam as a portrait painter mostly, and he also painted a wide range of narrative themes and landscapes. In 1642, Rembrandt was commissioned by a wealthy Civic Guard company to create a large group portrait of his members for its new meeting hall. This is the Night Watch from 1642. It's oil on canvas. It is almost 12 feet by almost 14.5 feet, and it's actually been cut down from its original size. Rembrandt further advances on Hall's ideas about group portraiture. So remember Hall's, this guy over here, he doesn't just depict that kind of boring, like on the bleachers, portraiture. Instead, he has this dynamic composition of everybody kind of active and doing things. Well, Rembrandt kind of takes that a step further. This is an interesting image because it was called the Night Watch later, so he didn't title it the Night Watch. And it was called that by art historians because it was a very dark image. But it turns out it was actually just dirty. We can now see, so it's been cleaned now, and we can actually see an indication of architecture in the background. So like when I first studied this image in undergraduate, let's not say how long ago that was, it was still called the Night Watch, and you really couldn't see all this detail, but they've since cleaned it. And now we can see the architecture in the background. We can see how it's depicting a company preparing for a parade in the Amsterdam street. So at the time of the painting, the Civic Guard really was more ceremonial they weren't really needed for defense. So it was more like what we saw with this image. It's the militia kind of being used as sort of a club. There should be 18 members in this portrait, and 18 names are on this shield over here. Now, this is in the background wall, and it was actually added afterwards. It was not, that shield was not created by Rembrandt. Now, it was originally an extremely large painting. It was 13 by 16 feet, and it did originally contain the 18 guardsmen and 16 other figures. We have this little girl who sort of seems kind of out of place, but remember, they are preparing for a parade. Some people believe that she is a pun on the gun name, so she's called Clower, which is the group's name is called the Cloveneers, and she might be sort of the mascot figure of the militia company. We're not exactly sure what her purpose is in this painting. She does kind of seem a little bit random. Here, Rembrandt is transforming the traditional Dutch group portrait into interacting scene of tension, drama, color, and motion. And this is indeed really a painting that appeals to all the senses. When you look at this painting, not only do you have the nice contrast, the chiaroscuro, between light and dark, we also can hear this dog barking. We can hear the sounds of the drums beating. We can hear the muskets. He's loading his musket. Someone's firing a musket. We can hear the cries of the children. We can get a sense of the voices of the men as they're talking and preparing. It does look like they're all active and discussing things, especially this guy. He's explaining to this guy what needs to be done for this parade. So this is actually Captain Banning Kokwa. He is in the foreground, and he is depicted with this. He's in black, and he has this red sash, and he's in charge. Next to him is his lieutenant, and he's in yellow, and they're preparing to lead the yet unorganized, the unorganized ranks. There's a sense of movement. Everyone seems like they're doing something. It's like they're striding forward, particularly these guys, but this guy too. Everyone seems to be on alert, ready to get ready for this this parade. But also there's a lot of use of those diagonal lines pulling us into the composition, and even in the way that the people are arranged. He does a really great job, Rembrandt does a really great job using foreshortening to create, like especially with the captain's hands. He does a great job. And then this one's kind of in shadow a little bit, using foreshortening to create that, the way that his hands are posed. He also kind of calls for the viewers to get involved. We kind of feel like we're watching an actual scene. When we start to study each individual part, we feel like we're kind of getting pulled in as if we're watching, you know, like a TV show or a movie. And here these people are active. They're about to do something. So we feel like we're watching an actual scene. And we almost feel like we need to hurry up and get out of the way so that they can continue to organize. They're about to walk right into us. He does use that strong tenebrism or chiaroscuro to create the contrast between light and dark. You can see it very highlighted through here and then very dark back here and dark through here. That heightens the drama and the movement of the scene. The light also kind of highlights the people's portraits, because remember, this is meant to be a group portrait, so we would want to see everyone's face as much as possible, or at least the important players' faces, people who paid basically. Here is another example of Rembrandt's work. I think keep this in mind when we later look at Thomas Eakins' work, so keep that in mind. Here's just some more examples of his later work. And then here, Rembrandt sought to supplement his income by making prints. He made etchings on metal plates, kind of like Dürer. The earliest ones date to 1627. A decade later, he began experimenting with making additions to these compositions with dry point technique. Dry point is when the artist uses a sharp needle to scratch shallow lines in a plate. He sought to exploit this medium to its full extent. Now, Rembrandt was actually deeply religious. He really studied the Bible intensely, and he was very concerned with the meaning of the life of Christ. It suggested that this can be seen in his three crosses images. He wanted to capture the moment described in the Gospel